These are your fast facts on 1st and 2nd Peter. First and 2nd Peter have vastly different writing styles. The Greek of 1 Peter is more complex and stylistic when compared to 2 Peter's rougher and more plain-spoken Greek. In 1 Peter 5:12, we find out that he's writing through Silvanus, or Silas, indicating that Paul's missionary partner Silas was serving as Peter's scribe. It seems likely that 1 Peter is representative of Peter's thoughts with the help of Silas's Greek skills, and it seems likely that 2 Peter is representative of Peter without the help of a skilled scribe. Second, 2 Peter refers back to 1 Peter. In 2 Peter 3:1, the author indicates that he had previously sent a letter to these people. This, in part, is how we can be reasonably confident about the order of these two epistles. Third, 2 Peter refers to Paul's letters. In 2 Peter 3:15-16, Peter refers to the letters of Paul as hard to understand, but also refers to them as Scripture. Given that this letter was written to locales where Paul was known to have written letters, this reference makes excellent sense. It is also possible that 2 Peter 3:10 is a reference to 1 Thessalonians 5:2-4. Fourth, 2 Peter is the most questioned New Testament book by modern scholars. As a result of the previous 3 points, the writing styles, the references to 1 Peter, and to Paul's letters, many modern scholars reject the ascription of this book to Peter. On the contrary, however, we should note that such a position requires the burden of proof in order to set aside the extensive tradition of church history and the manuscript traditions surrounding the book. However, reasonable explanations exist for each of the concerns about the authenticity of the book. Fifth, Babylon was probably a cryptic reference to Rome. 1 Peter 5:13 refers to Christians who are with Peter in Babylon, along with Mark. Since we don't have any indication of a first-century church in Babylon or the presence of Mark or Peter in that city, it seems reasonable to think that Peter is using the word Babylon as a sort of code that those who are familiar with the Old Testament would have understood. In the Old Testament, Babylon was the great and final enemy of the people of God and the seat of the major governmental authority at the close of the Old Testament. In Peter's day, Rome would be a perfect parallel to Babylon. Sixth, we know a few details about the recipients and purposes of these letters. We don't know a lot of details, but here's what we do know. Areas listed in 1 Peter 1:1, such as Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, are heavily Gentile areas. In 1 Peter 1:12, he indicates that someone else first announced the gospel in these churches. For many, this person was likely the Apostle Paul, whose letters are commended in the second epistle by Peter. 1 Peter addresses early forms of persecution coming on churches in this area. The emperor cult was strong here, so this church would have experienced exclusion from their families, businesses, and social events. They probably were experiencing various forms of harassment or legal charges, but full-blown persecution had not yet arrived. 2 Peter addresses false teachers. The pressure of persecution does not result in freedom from false doctrine. Lastly, 1 and 2 Peter address largely the same group of people, as we noticed in that 2 Peter refers over to 1 Peter and expects that people would know which book he was talking about. Seventh, 1 Peter isn't just a book about suffering. 1 Peter is a book known for its treatment on the topic of suffering. The Greek word for suffering, pasco, appears 12 times in the 5-chapter book. And 1 Peter accounts for nearly 30% of the occurrences of this word in the New Testament. So the theme of suffering is truly significant, but there's a theme that's actually more significant in 1 Peter than suffering. The Greek word for glory, doxa, in its noun or verb forms appears 16 times throughout the book. Thus, the twin themes of suffering and glory are interrelated. Peter is carefully charting a unique path of suffering. He is not charting the path of the fatalist. The fatalist encounters suffering and ends up responding in suicide or despair. He is not charting the path of the masochist. The masochist enters suffering and stays there because they derive a strange pleasure out of the suffering itself. He is not charting the path of the escapist. The escapist seeks to avoid suffering. There's a secular variety of the escapist that will try to isolate, insulate, and numb themselves from the pain of this world. But there's a religious variety of escapism that pretends away pain and suffering, preaching only health and wealth for those who have enough faith or who give enough to a church or leader. What Peter does give us is the path of Jesus. Jesus went to the cross and proceeded on to exponential degrees of glory. The Christian gets the opportunity to walk in the same path of Jesus, or as Peter puts it in 1 Peter 4:13, rejoice as you share in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may rejoice with great joy when his glory is revealed. This sheds new light on the claim in 1 Peter 2:21, where he calls us to walk in his steps. Peter isn't just telling people to be good and moral like Jesus. Peter is calling Christians to a path of suffering that moves intentionally through the suffering of Jesus and on to greater glory that is in back of it. Eighth, 2 Peter is closely related to Jude. You'll probably notice that most commentaries address 2 Peter and Jude together. There is a high degree of overlap in the two books on topics and concepts, and even the order in which those items appear in the books. What seems likely is that one or the other borrowed from the other. Ninth, Peter loves the Old Testament. 1 Peter quotes from 15 verses of the Old Testament, or an average of 3 verses per chapter. Roughly 30 Old Testament allusions exist in the book. Peter shows deep familiarity with and respect of the Old Testament, with quotations coming from Exodus, Leviticus, Psalms, Proverbs, and Isaiah. 10th, Peter frequently points to Christ's earthly ministry. Throughout these epistles, we see allusions to the transfiguration of Jesus, the upper room, Jesus' final instructions to Peter, Christ's own preaching, and the suffering and resurrection of Jesus. All of these aspects and more point to Peter's incredible familiarity with the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. 11th, who are the spirits in prison? There are 4 main ways to understand 1 Peter 3:19. 1. Some would say that Jesus spiritually preached through Noah. As 2 Peter 2:5 indicates, Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Thus, for Jesus to be speaking through him could be plausible in our understanding of this verse. Second, others would say Jesus physically preached a salvation message, providing a second chance to those who are in hell. This view holds that between his death and resurrection, Jesus offered another chance to all those who had died before his coming. This view contradicts Scripture, according to Hebrews 9:27. Third, others would say Jesus physically preached a salvation message to Old Testament saints and took them with him to heaven. This view holds that between Jesus' death and resurrection, Jesus entered a place known as Abraham's bosom and told them the good news and took them on to heaven. This is a possible interpretation that doesn't necessarily contradict Scripture, but it also doesn't have much in the text to justify it. Fourth, others would say Jesus proclaimed victory over the satanic realm. Some would say that this event happened physically between the death and resurrection of Jesus. Others would claim that it happened metaphorically at his resurrection. This view highlights 2 primary exegetical details. First, that the word spirits nearly exclusively across the whole of the New Testament suggests non-human spiritual beings, and second, that the word for prison here does not specifically indicate the realm of the dead or hell as the place of punishment. While views 1 and 3 are plausible, the 4th view seems the most likely for the exegetical reasons and for its connection with the next question we'll examine. 12th, who are the angels sent to hell to be held in judgment? In 2 Peter 2:4, Peter talks about angels that sinned and were sent to a very specific place, Tartarus. It appears only here in the New Testament, but it's a word that shows up in the Jewish apocryphal book of 1 Enoch. In 1 Enoch 18, this book describes a judgment that comes on a group of angelic spirits called the Watchers. These Watchers were angels that had sexual relations with human women and were required to be placed in prison. In 1 Enoch 19, a good angel, Uriel, brings these Watchers before God to meet their punishment. And then in 1 Enoch 20, Uriel is given watch, presumably over imprisoned Watchers, in a place called Tartarus. In summary, there are other possibilities that have been suggested for the meaning of 2 Peter 2:4, but none of them can explain away the obvious parallel between 2 Peter and 1 Enoch 18-20. The use of the word Tartarus, the timeline of the events in the passage, such as the fallen angels of Genesis 6 in verse 4, then the judgment at the time of Noah in Genesis 7, coming in verse 5, and then the judgment on Sodom in Genesis 19 follows in verse 6. Further, this understanding could possibly help confirm our interpretation of 1 Peter 3:19, especially in the way that it intersects these spirits in prison with the days of Noah. One caveat is worth mentioning here. Some may wonder what this means for the Jewish Apocrypha and for its interpretation of Genesis 6. Regarding the Apocrypha, Peter is not quoting it as Scripture, but he is building an argument with it alongside the canonical stories of Noah and Lot. Thus, Peter saw at least this portion of 1 Enoch as helpful and as providing an accurate interpretation of Genesis 6. This still falls way short of any sort of endorsement of 1 Enoch as canonical, inspired, or even accurate outside of those key elements of the chapters we've highlighted. Does baptism save you? In 1 Peter 3:21, Peter says that baptism now saves you. So is this baptismal regeneration? I don't think this is reasonable for two reasons. One, this verse points backward. Baptism, which corresponds to this, is Peter's way of saying that baptism is like the waters of the flood that he mentions in verse 20. The waters of Noah's flood, quote unquote, saved 8 people by killing off the unrighteous and leaving only the righteous alive. An odd metaphor if Peter meant to indicate baptismal regeneration. I think he would have probably linked baptism to the ark and not the floodwaters. But rather, the floodwaters were the means by which those in the ark were differentiated from those outside the ark. So too, baptism weeds out the righteous from the unrighteous through an identification with the death of Jesus. 2, the verse also points inward. Baptism is a pledge of a good conscience. Thus, baptism serves as the pledge or the signing of the contract that shows that our salvation is legitimate. Peter connects closely the ideas of salvation and baptism, but he's not making the latter a requirement for the former. And those are your fast facts on the books of 1 and 2 Peter.